Okay, so Eric and I are here today to talk to you guys about prairie reconstruction and research that's been happening here at Eastern. We'll kind of go through a little review of the kind of current state of the prairie in general, what Eastern is doing to try and address some of that, and then share some of the work that we've both done in our own master's projects, and then share some of the research of other students as it relates to prairie reconstruction and research as well. So no project or no presentation is complete without an introduction to exactly what it is we're going to be talking about. So what is the Palouse Prairie? I think a lot of people, maybe when they hear the word Palouse, they think of Palouse Falls, or perhaps, you know, they think of those rolling Los hills that you can find when you go from here down, here being Spokane Cheney area, down to Pullman, and a whole bunch of agriculture, wheat, soybeans, lentils, chickpeas, things like that. But for more time than not, this area called the Palouse Prairie, you can see here is crosshatched in with these lines. This is like the core Palouse area. And then depending on what you're interested in, whether it's vegetation communities or I don't know, topography, whatnot, can have some additional extensions that expands the range a little bit of the Palouse Prairie region. And for more time than not, it was covered in incredibly diverse vegetation communities consisting largely of bunch grasses and a whole bunch of different flowering plants called forbs. These are just a couple of pictures of prairie remnants. Often you also find shrubs like snowberry and roses mixed into the bunch grass and forb communities. And then oftentimes you also have a lot of hawthorn kind of clumps as well dotting the landscape. So this vegetation community, like I said, incredibly diverse, incredibly rich with different kinds of plants. And that diversity has really helped for a very long time maintain a healthy environment in this region. You know, that diversity of plants helped anchor that really light, low soil to the ground, preventing erosion. All of the incredibly deep roots of the prairie plants aided in groundwater infiltration. And then those deep roots also were really key for carbon sequestration and nutrient cycling. There's a really cool study that was done in 1915 by this guy right here, J.E. Weaver. And he went into prairie remnants and excavated root systems of plants to kind of see their depth and their architecture, which, like, to me now, knowing the state of the prairie seems like very painful to like go into these beautiful places and excavate giant trenches. But nonetheless, you know, he did it and got some really cool results. This right here is arrowleaf balsam root, that big yellow sunflower looking plant that is all over the region. He found roots that go, you know, down up to 9 feet into the ground. And over here, you can see kind of the top growth to bottom growth of these bunch grasses. So in a lot of ways, when you look out at the prairie, it's kind of like looking out at a glacier, where what you see on the top is just like a little tip of the amount of overall biomass and growth. And then what's down at the bottom is incredibly expansive. So not only do those prairie systems historically support a lot of vegetation diversity and animal diversity, they're also really important parts of an ecocultural landscape. So, you know, for time immemorial, these systems have supported the lives of indigenous peoples, from providing foods and medicines to providing, you know, a surplus of roots that were a foundation of their historical intertribal economies. And the descendants of the first people of the Palouse are now a part of several different contemporary tribal nations. Up here in the Spokane Cheney area, of course, we're occupying the homelands of the Spokane tribe. And then as you go kind of south and then in other directions into the broader Palouse region as well, you're entering the territories of people who are now part of, you know, the Coeur d'Alene tribe, the Kalispel tribe of Indians, the Nez Perce tribe, the Confederated Tribes and Bands of the Yakama Nation, and the Confederated Tribes of the Colville Reservation as well. And so, you know, the plants that are in the prairie, these prairie systems, while they have diminished in range, they are still, you know, very culturally significant to a bunch of different people today. And yeah, because of the kind of limited ecosystem, their ability to exercise their treaty rights to gather a lot of these culturally significant species have been impacted. So with that, I'm going to transition to Erik.
Hi, everybody. So I guess I get the somewhat dubious task, as Sarah alluded to. Unfortunately, the Palouse is really the story of an ecosystem in danger of being lost forever. You can see this lush ecotype nowadays through multiple agricultural conversions might look something more like this. In fact, in the figure from Black et al. In 1998, you can see this historical vegetation and keep in mind, this is the core Palouse that Sarah mentioned earlier, being almost entirely dominated by this fescue bunchgrass situation, which alludes to the Palouse Prairie. And fast forward to 1998, when this study was done, almost a complete conversion to this cropland situation. And really, you know, maybe a nod to human ingenuity, if you want to look at it like that. But it really was this team effort to convert to agriculture, starting about 1880. Over the course of the next 40 approximately years, 90% of the prairie would be converted. And today, less than 1% still remains. Those remaining pieces are what we call remnants, and often these are in the form of eyebrows on steeper slopes, places where plowing really wasn't possible, especially to that early technology. These places aren't perfect and probably have undergone some changes in the past 100 years, but they're still a remaining piece of the original prairie and kind of our best knowledge of what those original prairies may have looked like. So you might be asking yourself, other than maybe a few species lost, why does it matter? And this conversion to agriculture brings with it a couple big environmental detriments, of which erosion is probably the largest and most visible problem. As you can see from this image on the left, this is a survey done by the USDA in 1978. Just a pretty extreme amount of soil sloughing off the landscape. And that's really due to the loss of those soil anchoring plants from the native prairie. And that's exacerbated by farming practices like tilling, you know, continually loosening that soil, and a summer fallow that just exposes that soil layer to the open air. As of 1995, an estimated 40% of the soil has been lost from the Palouse. And as you might see in the picture to the right, these are some of those effects of that runoff. Reduced visibility, reduced water quality, increased nutrients, pesticides, herbicides. I think it's pretty clear which one might have runoff issues. And in addition to the erosion, as we face issues with climate change mitigation, carbon sequestration becomes a goal of a lot of projects. And soils can act as a huge carbon sink as forms of soil organic matter, microbial communities, root structures, etc. So if we look at these first two figures on the left, we can see proposed ideals of as number of species increases, as does soil carbon storage rates. And then on the right-hand side, you can see as a factor of time soil carbon concentration. And what you'll notice is that as the number of species goes up, so too does the amount of carbon the soil can hold. I'll get into this a little bit more detail later, but my study alone identified about 250 plants across the Palouse in general. So you could probably imagine what these graphs might look like if we had 10%, 25% of that level of diversity. We're talking about major carbon storage. And so that really leads us into why we want to restore these prairies. These are diverse systems. Soil carbon stocks can be rebuilt. The soil we lost, we're not going to get back, but we still do have a lot of soil on the Palouse that we can hold. So basically, there are still reasons to have hope, but we have to start investing in this environmental repair now. And that's exactly the project goals of the Prairie Restoration at Eastern. It was originally inspired by carbon sequestration. And this is about a 120-acre restoration that was former agricultural land. And we are slowly taking that land back and putting it into prairie. This project has ecological goals, but it's also being conducted as a multidisciplinary site. So with opportunities for recreation, education, research, long-term biological monitoring, archaeological techniques, hiking trails, soil analysis, the list kind of goes on. And as you can see in the pictures to the right, this project has already provided opportunities for educational outreach within the community. Groups from elementary schools to assisted living facilities and everyone in between, learning skills in seed collection, planting, identification, and just more about the prairie in general. And I think that's maybe one of the limiting factors to how much we can save these prairies is there's so little left, not a lot of people know much about it. And so I would like to mention that recently this project got its first major start in the 12-acre pilot area, right in this area where research is already going on and there are actually seeds in the ground. So it's pretty exciting to say that we have taken the first step that will eventually lead to all 120 acres being planted in this original prairie. So it's really exciting right now. But with that, that kind of brings up the issue of, we know we should restore, we know we're trying to restore, but our area is outside of that much more well understood Palouse Prairie, the core area. So we don't know as much about it. And I kind of liken that to starting a brand new puzzle without the picture on the box. We could get there eventually, but it's much easier if we understood the ecosystems around us. And that kind of really led into my project, the exploratory analysis of vegetation communities in Spokane and Whitman counties. First, a little bit of background about the area. Maybe I'm making too big of a leap, but I assume I don't have to talk on end about the channeled scablands to a geology club. But basically, from a vegetation point of view, when the Missoula floods came in, scoured the landscape, exposed the bedrock, this made it just a bear for plants to survive. It is a very hard life living in the channeled scablands for a plant. So we have an immediate change in plant communities. Only the strong can survive in these areas. But we still have these speckled deeper soil islands. And then if you look at the right figure, this is a precipitation map of the area with drier conditions as you head west. So you see Cheney is in this area of about 12 to 16 inches of precipitation a year, whereas the core Palouse is much more centered in this 16 to 20 inches per year. And so we really kind of take these borders into consideration when we're looking at the prairie and looking for the remnants, because we want reference zones as close to our site as we can get. Going back to the puzzle analogy, you know, this using information from other areas would kind of be like getting a related puzzle box, but not the one for our project. So with those boundaries in mind, I used aerial photography to try and identify little prairie remnants across these deeper soil islands. And these kind of look like this, where we're really looking for these small little areas with no obvious plow lines, no man-made structures, and even further, these little dots are actually ponderosa pine. So we know at the very least that these sites have not been plowed in quite some time. So I went across all of Spokane County, keeping those earlier boundaries in mind, and went through and identified as many as I could, sent out contact letters, gained permission to get on these lands, and came up with sites that I wanted to explore further. You'll notice that, let's see, up here is Airway Heights. Down here would be Pullman. So some sites include the channeled scablands, some sites include Palouse Prairie North, and some sites include Palouse Prairie in the core area. This allowed us to ask questions. What does the Palouse look like versus channeled? What does North Palouse look like versus South Palouse? And so just to give you an idea of what we do at these locations, each location we set out 10 of these 1 meter square plots. For these meter square plots, we identify every plant down to species, and then we assign a percent cover, or how much of that plot these plants take up. And with that, we did 135 plots across these two counties. And these are really samples of the ecosystem. Once we throw that into a community matrix, we can start to tease out what factors affect where plants are, what these different communities look like, and how they might be related to each other. And I just wanted to share one last quick and easily digestible results. This is the result of a indicator species analysis. Basically, it looks at all 135 plots, looks at which plots go in which group, and then it spits out which species are most important for those groups. So in this case, my groups were channeled scablands and Palouse Prairie. We can see that the plants on the right were the top 3 most important to tell you that you are in the Palouse Prairie. And the ones on the left were the most important to tell you that you're in the channeled scablands. A few really interesting to me takeaways from this, and maybe room for future research, is that all the plants for the Palouse Prairie are native, whereas the ones for the channeled scablands, 2 out of the 3 are some of the worst invasive species that Washington State has to deal with. So maybe that might suggest that our vegetation communities in these Palouse Prairie remnants are doing pretty well. It's just land conversion that threatens those. Whereas in the channeled scablands, maybe it's less about land conversion and more about invasive species. And so with that, understanding these vegetation communities was one of the major gaps that I noticed in our knowledge. And I'll kick it over to Sarah.
All right. Thanks for coming back to our presentation. Yeah, so Eric kind of gave an overview of a really big knowledge gap that existed in the Palouse Prairie ecosystem, that gap being the little bit of knowledge that we possess in the northern Palouse kind of border areas. And that's just one of many different either knowledge gaps that we have or challenges that exist in the realm of Palouse Prairie restoration, reconstruction. And so what I really wanted to do with part of my thesis project was to kind of dig in to what those other areas are that are in need of further investigation and research. Because in the last 20 years, people have been working really hard to learn the best practices of how to restore these systems. But there's still a lot of work that needs to be done to improve outcomes. And you know, I figured that because we have this opportunity here at Eastern with this Prairie Restoration Project, we can, you know, really engage in testing those current best practices, fill in those knowledge gaps, and increase our outreach and involvement of different stakeholder groups. And so in order to do that, you kind of need to know what the current state of things is and where you're going. So that's what I endeavored to do. My project goals were to investigate the current state of prairie reconstruction or restoration in the Palouse, and then also to identify different challenges and opportunities that are present to help move the field forward into the future. And you know, I really designed it as a document that could be picked up by anybody that's interested in, you know, being involved in bettering this ecosystem, to see where they can kind of put their best efforts into improving outcomes. So to do this, I interviewed a bunch of different prairie restoration practitioners and plant material specialists throughout the region. And I'm going to share some of my results in my actual needs assessment document. I go into them in much greater detail than I'll cover right now. But if you want to know those greater details, I am more than happy to share the entire document with you. So kind of the current state of restoration, where we're at right now. Most of the projects happen on private lands as opposed to county lands, state or federal, because most of the land within the Palouse region is privately owned. And that means that in order for prairie restoration to move forward, we really need to do a good job of engaging our private landowners, both small acreage landowners and agricultural landowners as well. Most of the projects have been happening on that small acreage kind of private land and not on land that is used in agriculture. And there has been kind of an unequal distribution among the counties as well of where projects are happening. So most of the projects are in Latah County, which is, you know, over on the Idaho part of the region. And then following Latah County, Whitman County, and very, very few projects have occurred in Spokane County, even within the core Palouse area that is part of Spokane County. I think Eastern and then an upcoming project on private land near Turnbull are the two prairie restoration projects that I could find within Spokane County. In general, people take on restoration projects because they know about the status of the prairie and they want to help mitigate that. They're interested in building habitat for animals like pollinators. They have been interested in landscaping trends, I suppose, such as xeriscaping or using low water and low nutrient input plants in their landscaping. And then in the places that have been in agricultural settings, it has been generally to retire or set aside unproductive agricultural land or land that you can get enrolled in different federal cost sharing programs like the Conservation Reserve Program or other state or federal programs. And in general, people are learning about the possibility of reconstruction, mostly through word of mouth, talking with friends and neighbors, or connecting with their local conservation districts or at public education events from advocacy groups like the Palouse Prairie Foundation. The Practitioners outlined a bunch of different challenges, both logistical and technological, and then ecological, that need to be worked through in order to increase the success of prairies. These are some of the main themes of those logistical challenges. Practitioners reported that, restoration often follows preservation of the prairies that we have left, because we can't, no matter how hard we try, recreate the diversity and the functionality, at least yet, of those remnants. And since those remnants are still under threat, we can't just build our way out of conserving the Palouse. There needs to also be an effort to help preserve the stuff that we have now currently. Restoration can also be expensive, particularly if you are conducting it over a fair number of acres. If you are doing it in your yard and hand broadcasting some seeds, as this kind of person up here in this top picture is doing, the price and the amount of effort is pretty manageable. But once you get up to doing, half an acre, 50 acres, the amount of effort and tools and equipment and costs can increase pretty dramatically. And along with that, the availability of some of those cost sharing programs where you can get some assistance to conduct these conservation activities on private lands, those opportunities have been dwindling somewhat. There's also a need for access to equipment and knowledgeable operators, because as I mentioned, a lot of the projects are happening on land that is not agricultural and by people who are not farmers, so they don't necessarily have the equipment needed to conduct these projects, nor do they know how to operate the equipment if they were to get a hold of it. So that's a little bit of a bottleneck. Usually people have, a neighbor or something that can help them out, but there's a little bit of infrastructure missing on how to connect landowners to those resources if they need them. We also need more interested landowners. The majority of the interest for doing these projects has been around the population centers of Moscow and Pullman. And then in any of the more rural areas outside of those two population centers, the relative interest in conducting these projects has been pretty low. And practitioners also reported that there's this kind of lingering idea that natives won't grow here, meaning, back when these types of projects were being initiated 20 years ago, there were a fair number of failures because of a variety of different reasons that have since been identified, and those methods have been worked through. And, now it is possible to reconstruct with some diversity, a facsimile of our native prairies. You can see that in this lower picture. But that persistent idea from people that tried it and failed a long time ago still, is around in the region. And then that is something that needs to be overcome. There's also a fair number of ecological challenges, as I've mentioned. A lot of the sites that have had projects done on them have been varied in some different way. And then the conditions from year to year are also variable, which makes predicting success a little bit of a challenge. Weed management, as anybody who works in restoration knows, weeds, invasive species, are one of the largest challenges to the success of any project, and Palouse reconstructions are no different. Here you can see, this is a native prairie remnant actually, but invasive grasses are also large threats to them. In this dark corner, there's kind of our native vegetation. And then everything that's over here in this light yellow color is Medusa head, which is an invasive annual grass that is very, very difficult to get rid of. There's also a lot of different challenges with getting forbs, so those flowering species, to establish. Grasses we're pretty good at reliably establishing. And depending on the site conditions, forbs can be easier or harder, but there's more research about techniques and best practices that needs to go into that. And then the plant materials that we have available to use for these projects are also somewhat limited. The general rule for restoration projects is that, you want to try and get a good diversity of different kinds of plants. And we really only have a small number of species that are available compared to the entire diversity of the prairie. Particularly, one group that's lacking is annual species. Almost everything that is currently available is a perennial. That's either grasses or perennial, like flowering plants. And of those species that are available, very few of them are from kind of local sources of seed. And in general, in restoration, the rule is that local is better. But a lot more research needs to go into understanding the genetic kind of makeup and architecture of the species that we have here in this region. And, you know, perhaps some of them don't need to be that local. Perhaps some of them really do in order to succeed. You know, there's a lot of different ways that we could address these challenges. And I think that, you know, the project here at Eastern can really help act as a catalyst and like a springboard for some of these remedies. I think that, you know, to solve a lot of the problems, it's going to take interdisciplinary research. So not just among environmental scientists, but also among social scientists, because a lot of the problems of the Palouse are human created and social problems. They aren't specifically ecological problems. So, you know, why do people not seem very interested in conducting restoration and reconstruction on their property, you know, in areas outside of that population center? There's been some work to kind of suss out people's values and beliefs around conservation and restoration, but I think more work is needed, especially in identifying different landowner motivations for participating in programs, or if we could create new types of programs that would incentivize conservation on private lands. Additionally, there's obviously a need for applied ecological research. I identified a bunch of different knowledge gaps in the field. Some were practitioner identified and some were areas that arose through the conversations that I had with people, but that is certainly a need and ripe for collaboration between not just Eastern, but also other universities within the Palouse, University of Idaho and Washington State University, of course. We need a lot more education and outreach. As Erik mentioned earlier, a big barrier is, you know, just people's awareness and knowledge of the prairie. And I think involving people from marketing and communication fields could also really help, you know, get the Palouse a good PR message. And then increased collaboration among practitioners and operators, landowners, and different agencies in the region so that we can all work together and learn from each other and increase our success. And if we lay that foundation now, we could really take advantage of future opportunities, such as funding to use conservation to mitigate climate change, which I think is going to be a big part of what could inject some funding into this region in the future. So if you want to know more about some of the stuff that I just presented, our contact information or my contact information is going to be at the end of this. Here we go. It'll be at the end of this presentation, and I'm very happy to share more with you. So Erik and I aren't the only students either that have been doing research in the Palouse and on Palouse Prairie reconstruction. So I wanted to share a little bit more about some of the other students. Here we have an undergraduate student, Seth, who has been researching the effect of biochar on the prairie restoration. So he's looking at the effect of the biochar and native plant diversity on soil food webs using nematodes, which is pretty cool. This is a picture of some of the folks involved in the restoration project spreading biochar. We also have Christy Snyder, who's a graduate student who is kind of in charge of that pilot seeding project that Erik mentioned earlier. She is looking at the effect of adding some annual species and also the effect of biochar on plant establishment and invasive species recruitment in these restorations at the university. We have Ethan Bean, who's another graduate student who is looking at the kind of genetic architecture of blue bunch wheatgrass, which is a common bunch grass that's used in restoration projects. And he was trying to see if the populations that we have in remnants around here are genetically related or isolated from each other, and if they are, how related they are to the populations of different seed sources that are currently available, to see if we can match up some seed sources that are available with what is more genetically matched to this environment. We have undergrad Rachel Pentico, who's looking at the feedback loops of soils and plants on different slopes in Palouse Prairie remnants to see if aspect north or south has a difference in plant recruitment and in, invasion resistance. And then last but not least, we have Emma Hoskins, who is here with the backpack. And she has been looking at pollinator networks in the Palouse and how those networks how those networks differ, or if they don't differ, among restored systems and remnant prairie. And then this is her field assistant last year, Ashley, working on some plant identification at Turnbull. You can see one of their little monitoring plots over there. So there's a lot of different projects that have been going on. And, you know, that's just the beginning. There's going to be a lot more going into the future. And so if you're wondering, you know, how could you help the prairie if you're feeling motivated to do so, I think the best thing that you can do is tell folks about it. A lot of people don't know that it exists, that it's endangered, that they can do anything to help it. So the more people can know about it, the better. And a really great thing to do is to take folks to those prairie remnants that you can access. They make good day trips if you want to go down to like Kamiak Butte or Steptoe Butte down in the heart of the Palouse. That's a great place to go check it out. You can also volunteer your time at the restoration site here at Eastern. We're gonna have, you know, a big need for people to help doing seed collections and cleanings, doing you know, invasive species control, all sorts of stuff like that. If you have an idea for a research project that you could utilize that space for, it's open to, you know, be a living laboratory for all sorts of different students, not just biology ones. So talk to your professors about that. If you have a research idea, you can connect with stewardship groups such as the Palouse Prairie Foundation, who host different events taking care of prairie remnants. And if you live somewhere that you can, try and plant some native plants, even if it's just, you know, 5 different flower seeds and like 3 different grasses, you'd still be making a really big difference. And then because they're beautiful, people would be interested in doing more of that in their own landscape if they see your little example. So with that, I think I will stop talking and we can kind of move into questions if anybody has those. And then that's the contact information for myself, Eric. And then the last one is Eric Budsberg, who is the kind of project manager for the project.